Emperor Diocletian stands as one of the most transformative figures in Roman history, a ruler whose reign marks the end of the traditional principate and the beginning of the late Roman Empire. When he came to power in the late 3rd century, the Roman world was in turmoil. For decades, emperors had risen and fallen with alarming speed. Civil wars, foreign invasions, economic breakdown, and plague had shaken the empire to its core. Many contemporaries believed that Rome was in decline, perhaps even approaching its end. Diocletian's importance lies in the way he confronted this deep crisis, reshaping the political structure, the military, the economy, and even the ideological foundations of imperial rule. Diocletian was born around the year 244, probably in Dalmatia on the eastern Adriatic coast, in what is now Croatia. Unlike the aristocratic emperors of earlier centuries, he came from a relatively humble background. He rose through the ranks of the army, proving his abilities as a commander and administrator. This military career was typical for 3rd century emperors. But what set Diocletian apart was not just his rise to power, it was the breadth and ambition of the reforms he would undertake once he secured the throne. In 284, after a period of violent instability, Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by his troops. He soon eliminated his rival Carinus and became the undisputed ruler of the Roman Empire. Yet he understood that the challenges before him were enormous. The empire's borders were under pressure on multiple fronts, from Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube, and from the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire in the east. Internally, usurpers frequently declared themselves emperor, using discontented armies to press their claims. The old system, in which a single emperor tried to govern and defend the entire enormous empire, no longer seemed sustainable. Diocletian's most famous and far-reaching innovation was the creation of the tetrarchy, literally rule of 4. In his view, the empire needed more than one ruler to respond quickly to threats and to stabilize succession. Around 293, he appointed a trusted military colleague, Maximian, as co-emperor, or Augustus. Diocletian ruled primarily from the eastern part of the empire, while Maximian centered his power in the west. But Diocletian went further. He then brought in 2 junior emperors, known as Caesars, Galerius in the east and Constantius Chlorus in the west. Together, these 4 rulers formed a kind of imperial college, each responsible for major frontier regions and each intended to provide continuity, since a Caesar could succeed an Augustus in an orderly fashion. This collegial system was revolutionary. Instead of pretending that a single man could be everywhere, the tetrarchy acknowledged the empire's vastness and complexity. It also attempted to solve the recurring problem of civil war over succession by pre-designating heirs within a structured hierarchy. Although the tetrarchy did not last beyond the next generation, it stabilized the empire during Diocletian's own lifetime and set the stage for the future division between East and West. Another defining aspect of Diocletian's rule was his transformation of the emperor's public image. Earlier emperors had often emphasized a kind of modesty in theory, at least presenting themselves as first among equals or princeps, even if in practice they wielded absolute power. Diocletian rejected this old republican facade. He embraced a more openly autocratic, even sacred, conception of imperial authority, often called the dominate, from dominus or lord. Ceremonial around the emperor became much more elaborate. Access to him was closely controlled, and courtiers had to perform gestures of obeisance, such as prostration, similar to Eastern monarchic traditions. He clothed himself in jeweled robes and a diadem, signaling that the emperor was no longer merely a leading citizen, but an almost divine figure on earth. This change in style was not just about pomp. It was meant to reinforce stability and obedience in an era of chronic rebellion. By elevating the emperor above all others, Diocletian tried to discourage military commanders from seeing themselves as his equals or potential replacements. The emperor's person became the linchpin of order, sanctified by religion and surrounded by rigorous protocol. This new, more absolute form of rule would deeply influence the political culture of the late Roman and Byzantine empires. Diocletian also tackled the empire's chronic military and administrative weaknesses. The 3rd century had seen relentless barbarian incursions and internal revolts. Armies were large but often poorly supplied and quick to support usurpers. Diocletian expanded and reorganized the military, increasing the number of soldiers and creating more flexible field armies that could move quickly to trouble spots. He strengthened the frontiers with fortified bases and a more systematic defensive strategy. In doing so, he made the empire more resilient against sudden invasions. On the administrative side, Diocletian carried out a wide-ranging reorganization of the empire's provinces. The older provinces were often large and could give ambitious governors dangerous amounts of power. Diocletian subdivided many of these provinces into smaller units, creating dozens of new ones. He then grouped these provinces into larger administrative districts called dioceses, each overseen by a vicarius, who in turn reported to the imperial court. This layered bureaucracy gave the central government more direct oversight and limited the ability of any one official to control too much territory or too many troops. These reforms came with a cost, a larger, more complex bureaucracy that needed more revenue. The empire's economy had suffered from decades of war, debased coinage, and inflation. Diocletian attempted to stabilize the currency through monetary reforms, introducing new coins with higher silver content and trying to restore confidence in imperial money. He also undertook a comprehensive reassessment of the tax system. His administration sought to make taxation more regular, predictable, and tied to measurable units like land and population. The goal was to ensure that the state could reliably fund the army and bureaucracy needed to keep the empire secure. One of the most famous and controversial aspects of his economic policy was the Edict on Maximum Prices, issued around the year 301. This sweeping decree attempted to set maximum prices for a vast array of goods and services across the empire, from grain and wine to clothing and labor. It was a response to rampant inflation and profiteering, especially during times of crisis. Diocletian's government hoped that by fixing prices, it could protect ordinary people and restore some sense of order in the market. In practice, the edict was very hard to enforce. The empire was too large, local conditions varied widely, and the bureaucracy, though expanded, could not monitor every transaction. Sellers often ignored the maximum prices or withdrew goods from the market, causing shortages. Punishments could be severe, but the underlying economic issues could not be solved by decree alone. Still, the edict is historically important because it illustrates how far Diocletian was willing to go to manage the economy and shows the increasingly interventionist nature of the late Roman state. Religion was another arena in which Diocletian left a lasting, though dark, legacy. For most of the 3rd century, Roman authorities had tolerated the growth of Christianity, even if occasional local persecutions occurred. Under Diocletian, however, relations between the imperial government and Christians deteriorated sharply. Diocletian saw himself as a restorer of traditional Roman values and piety. He consulted oracles, restored temples, and linked the stability of the empire to the favor of the ancestral gods. In such a worldview, a growing religious group that refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods and rejected the emperor's cult could be seen as a dangerous threat to divine protection and civic unity. Beginning in 303, Diocletian and his colleagues launched what is known as the Great Persecution. A series of edicts ordered the destruction of Christian churches and scriptures, the arrest of clergy, and the requirement that Christians sacrifice to the Roman gods under penalty of imprisonment, torture, or death. This was one of the most systematic attempts to suppress Christianity in Roman history. While it was enforced more harshly in some regions than others, it caused great suffering and created a large number of martyrs whose stories would later be celebrated throughout the Christian world. Ironically, the persecution failed in its ultimate aim. Christianity survived and even strengthened its internal cohesion. Less than a decade after Diocletian retired, Constantine the Great would legalize Christianity and eventually favor it as the empire's leading religion. Diocletian thus appears in Christian memory as one of the last great persecutors, a ruler who tried and failed to halt the rise of a faith that would decisively shape the future of Europe and the Mediterranean. One of the most remarkable aspects of Diocletian's life is his voluntary abdication. In 305, after more than 20 years in power, he did something almost unheard of for a Roman emperor. He voluntarily stepped down from the throne. Following the succession system he had designed, both he and Maximian abdicated, allowing their Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, to become the new Augusti and appointing new junior Caesars beneath them. Diocletian withdrew to his palace near Salona on the Dalmatian coast, effectively retiring from politics. Ancient sources, some perhaps hostile to him, report that when envoys later approached Diocletian to ask him to resume power amid renewed turmoil, he refused, saying that if they could see the cabbages he was growing in his garden, they would never again urge him to return to political life. Whether this anecdote is literally true or not, it captures a powerful image: a former absolute ruler choosing a quiet life away from the constant crises of imperial government. Diocletian's abdication, however, did not prevent new struggles for power. The carefully balanced tetrarchic system soon came under strain as rivalries erupted among the emperors and their heirs. Civil wars followed, and eventually Constantine emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman world. Yet, even though Diocletian's exact system did not endure, many of his structural reforms did. The division of the empire into smaller provinces, the layered administrative hierarchy, the enhanced authority of the emperor, and the larger, reorganized army all remained hallmarks of the late Roman state. In terms of long-term importance, Diocletian can be seen as the architect of the late Roman Empire. Before him, the empire had been ruled in a style that still paid homage to republican traditions, even if they were largely symbolic. After him, the empire was openly autocratic, bureaucratic, and more rigidly organized. The empire's center of gravity also continued to shift eastward, a movement that would culminate in Constantine's foundation of Constantinople and the development of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. In a sense, Diocletian built the institutional framework that allowed the empire, especially its eastern half, to survive for centuries after the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century. His reign also highlights a broader historical question: how do empires adapt to crisis? Diocletian responded with centralization, more elaborate bureaucracy, and stronger ideological control. These measures secured the empire in the short and medium term, but some historians argue they contributed to a heavier tax burden and a more rigid social order, which could, over time, limit flexibility and local initiative. Whether one sees his reforms as necessary life support or as the beginning of a more brittle system, there is no denying their scale and ambition. Culturally, Diocletian's era reflects a transition from the classical world of the High Empire to a more late antique world of mixed traditions. Military leaders from the provinces, like Diocletian himself, took center stage. Eastern religious and ceremonial influences reshaped imperial ideology. The old city of Rome remained symbolically important, but became less central in practice, as emperors ruled from frontier capitals and new imperial residences. Diocletian's own palace at Split, parts of which still survive today, embodies this shift. More a fortified complex than a traditional Roman home, it looks forward to the fortified palaces and cities of the medieval world. In assessing Diocletian's importance, it is helpful to think in terms of contrast. If we compare the Roman Empire of the early 3rd century with the empire after his reign, we see a different kind of state. It is larger in its bureaucratic apparatus, more centralized in its decision-making, more authoritarian in its style of rule, and more open about the emperor's semi-divine status. The army is more professional and more permanently stationed along the frontiers. The economy is more controlled from above, at least in intention. Religious policy is more consciously tied to state ideology. These changes did not spring from Diocletian alone, but he crystallized and formalized trends that had been developing, and he pushed them further than any of his predecessors. At the same time, Diocletian's story is a reminder that even strong rulers operate within constraints. He could reform the provinces and restructure the army, but he could not dictate the deeper currents of economic change or fully control the beliefs of millions of subjects. His price edict demonstrates the limits of state power over complex markets. His persecution of Christians shows the difficulty of stamping out a widespread and deeply held faith. His carefully designed tetrarchy illustrates that even the best institutional plans can falter when faced with ambition, rivalry, and the unpredictability of human affairs. Yet, more than 1700 years later, historians still view Diocletian as a turning point. Without his reforms, the Roman Empire might have fragmented permanently in the 3rd century crisis. Because of his actions, the empire was reshaped rather than destroyed. It emerged as a different kind of state, one that would endure in its eastern form for more than 1,000 years after his time. The roads, cities, laws, and administrative habits that shaped late antiquity and the early Middle Ages all bear the imprint of his reign. In the end, Emperor Diocletian's importance lies not only in the offices he held or the battles he fought, but in the way he responded to an age of crisis with a comprehensive vision of imperial renewal. He was a builder of structures, political, military, economic, and ideological, that defined what it meant to govern a late antique superstate. Though not a household name like Julius Caesar or Augustus, he stands among the most consequential of Roman emperors. His legacy is the survival and transformation of the Roman world itself, a world that, in altered form, would continue to influence law, government, religion, and culture long after the last Roman emperor had vanished from the West.